Welcome everyone to the latest installment of the Research into Action webinar series. I'm Nicole Elguero, an analyst on CADCA's evaluation and research team. The purpose of this webinar series is to introduce coalition members and substance misuse preventionists to current and relevant research being conducted in the substance use and community coalition fields. In today's webinar, we're privileged to have Dr. Cassidy Loparco join us for a presentation on her recent research article, Driving Under the Influence of Alcohol, Cannabis, and Delta-8 THC, Perceived Likelihood, Risk Perceptions, and Behaviors, published in the Journal of Psychoactive Drugs in 2023. Dr. Cassidy Loparco is a postdoctoral fellow at George Washington University in the Department of Prevention and Community Health in the School of Public Health. Her research focuses on understanding the etiology of substance use and polysubstance use, particularly related to cannabis and novel psychoactive substances, for example, derived psychoactive cannabis products. Her research involves assessing structural determinants of substance use among adolescents and young adults. For example, her research examines drug marketing to inform regulation and enforcement to prevent youth exposure and initiation, pricing and taxation strategies to decrease heavy substance use and related harms and inequities, and the oversight of safety of substances like synthesis regulations. Now I'll turn it over to Dr. Loparco.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity. I'll go ahead and share my screen and I guess dive right in. Like Nicole said, my name's Cassidy Loparco, and today I'll be presenting on a paper called Driving Under the Influence of Alcohol, Cannabis, and Delta-8 THC, Perceived Likelihood, Risk Perceptions, and Behaviors. And like she mentioned, this was recently published in the Journal of Psychoactive Drugs. So I'd like to start off today with a brief outline of what I'll be discussing. I'll first begin with a brief background on alcohol and cannabis, and then go into more detail on Delta-8 THC, which is a psychoactive substance found in the cannabis plant. I'll then briefly go over a few theoretical mechanisms that may help understand why individuals may drive under the influence, followed by the study aims. And after reviewing the methods and results, I'll finish with the discussion of the limitations and implications. So alcohol and cannabis are the most commonly used impairing substances in the United States among young adults. In 2022, 48.7% of individuals aged 12 and older used alcohol in the past month, and 15% used cannabis in the past month. These numbers are higher when looking at age-specific prevalence, with 50.2% of 18 to 25-year-olds having used alcohol and 25.9% having used cannabis in the past month. Use of alcohol and cannabis are associated with several negative consequences, including academic and occupational challenges, driving while under the influence, dependence, respiratory problems, and changes in brain structure and cognition. Research also indicates that polysubstance use is associated with experiencing more negative consequences compared to using each substance independently. These consequences may be particularly harmful among adolescents and young adults, given that this is a crucial time for their brain development. Now I'm going to slightly shift our focus to Delta-8 THC. When we've traditionally thought about cannabis, it's been Delta-9 THC. That's because that's the most common form of THC found in the cannabis plant. However, there are more than 30 types of THC present in the cannabis plant. And in 2018, the Federal Agricultural Improvement Act, also known as the Farm Bill, was passed in an effort to increase the economic utility of hemp. Specifically, this bill defined cannabis as materials with more than 0.3% Delta-9 THC by dry weight, while everything else should be considered hemp. Many have interpreted this bill as implicitly legalizing all other compounds in the cannabis plant. The first substance to hit the market as a result of this loophole was Delta-8 THC, which is different than Delta-9 by a slight change in the chemical composition, and it exists in very low natural quantities in the cannabis plant. While there is no nationally representative data on Delta-8 use prevalence, research indicates that among a convenience sample of 4,000 young adults aged 18 to 34 across the US, 52% were aware of Delta-8, and of those, 70% had lifetime use of Delta-8. Motives for using Delta-8 and purported effects of use are similar to those for traditional cannabis. For example, research indicates that individuals use Delta-8 THC to reduce anxiety and stress, to experience euphoric effects, as a sleep aid, to self-treat medical conditions such as panic disorders and depression, and as a substitute for other drugs. Given its unique legal landscape, one large reason for using Delta-8 is its perceived federal legality. Those who use Delta-8 in place of other drugs responded that they did so because they perceived Delta-8 to have fewer and less severe side effects, less perceived addictiveness and withdrawal potential, greater perceived safety, greater retail availability, and lower prices. Many individuals who have used Delta-8 claim that the psychoactive effects are less potent and result in a more mild high and less anxiety when compared to traditional cannabis. However, there's very limited human subjects research on Delta-8. Consequences of Delta-8 use are similar to those for traditional cannabis, and they include lethargy, impaired coordination, slurred speech, low blood pressure, rapid changes in heart rate, and may lead to difficulty breathing, sedation, and coma in rare instances. Moreover, from January 1st, 2021 to February 28, 2022, there were over 2,000 calls to poison control relating to Delta-8 use, with 41% of these cases occurring among minors and 70% requiring evaluation from a healthcare facility. 40% of these cases were due to accidental exposure to Delta-8, and 82% of these unintentional exposures occurred among pediatrics. There are also consequences unique to Delta-8 and similar compounds. For example, because the natural concentrations of Delta-8 in the cannabis plant are so small, all of the Delta-8 in the marketplace is synthesized, most often from CBD. There are no federal restrictions or regulations on the synthesis process, including the ingredients that are used, content, purity, sanitation, quality, or safety. As such, there are often dangerous byproducts and inconsistent effects. Delta-8 products are also not often systematically tested for contaminants such as heavy metals, solvents, or pesticides, and they often don't have a purification or quality control process in place. Contaminants, including sulfuric acid, hydrochloric acid, pesticides, and various heavy metals, including mercury, have been found in Delta-8 products. And given the lack of a standardized process, Delta-8 products often have widely varying potencies, which may differ from the labeled amount and results in inconsistent effects. Although the prevalence of driving under the influence of alcohol and cannabis has decreased since the early 2000s, car accidents do continue to be a leading cause of death for young adults in the US. In 2021, among 16 to 25-year-olds, 5% had driven after using alcohol and 8% had driven after using cannabis in the past year. Because of the relative recency of Delta-8, there are no nationally representative data regarding the prevalence of driving under the influence of Delta-8. However, there have been reports of this. According to several health behavior theories, high behavioral willingness or intentions and low perceived risk are strong predictors of engaging in risky behaviors. Previous research has shown strong associations between driving under the influence of alcohol and cannabis and related risk perceptions. These risk perceptions are often substance specific, with some individuals believing that driving under the influence of certain drugs, such as alcohol, is more risky than other drugs, such as cannabis. Although research has yet to examine the perceived risk of driving under the influence of Delta-8, it is possible that Delta-8 DUI risk perceptions may be lower than alcohol or cannabis's because of the differences in the physical and cognitive effects of cannabis versus alcohol, and that Delta-8 is often marketed and perceived as a low potency form of cannabis. The current study focuses on the public health priority of reducing DUI involving various substances, especially among young adults. The current study is timely given the emerging role of Delta-8 as an understudied intoxicating substance and the implications for DUI and related consequences. To advance the evidence to inform DUI-related interventions, we examined the perceived likelihood and risk of driving under the influence of alcohol, cannabis, and Delta-8, and DUI behaviors among a subsample of young adults in the US. Amazon MTurk was used to recruit participants to complete a Qualtrics survey. Research does indicate that Amazon MTurk is quote unquote one of the worst offenders in terms of having careless responders, so we did take extra precautions to ensure the quality of the data, and I'll go over that in a minute. Data were from a cross-sectional online survey among 18 to 25-year-olds residing in the US. Only one response per IP address was allowed, and data were collected from July 12 to August 17, 2022. The survey took approximately 10 minutes to complete, and compensation ranged from 50 cents to $5. The university's IRB approved all study materials, and this project was determined to pose no more than minimal risk to participants. Like I mentioned before, we followed recommended methods for cleaning crowdsourced data. So briefly, of the 603 responses to the survey that we received, we removed individuals for having multiple submissions from a single MTurk profile, having the same response verbatim to some of the long response survey questions, reporting using bath salts, kratom, and Delta-7 THC, which are all either substances that don't exist or have an extremely low national prevalence rate, being outside of the study age range, incorrectly answering check questions such as what is 2 + 2, and lastly, reporting using Delta-8 despite not knowing about it, resulting in our final analytic sample of 189. All measures were adapted from nationally representative surveys. Participants were asked how likely they were to drive under the influence of alcohol, cannabis, and Delta-8 separately, and how much risk they perceived driving under the influence of each substance carried. Responses were rated on a continuous scale from 0 to 3, and responses were also used to create two variables indicating which of the three substances an individual had the highest and lowest perceived likelihood to drive under the influence of, and another two variables indicating which of the three substances individuals to perceive to have the most and least DUI risk. So if participants ranked some but not all of the substances equally, they were coded as having missing data for those recoded variables. Participants were also asked if they had ever heard of Delta-8, their past year use of alcohol, cannabis, and Delta-8, and their past year DUI of each substance. We also assessed some sociodemographics, including age, sex, and race ethnicity. In this sample, 59% were male, the mean age was 24, and 59% identified as non-Hispanic white. The distribution of the DUI perceived likelihood and risk measures was assessed using the Shapiro-Wilk and Skewness tests. Results were conflicting, so both the mean and median are presented. Descriptive statistics were used to describe the data, including t-tests, to examine differences in Delta-8 DUI-related perceived likelihood and risk between those who had versus had not heard of Delta-8. So among all participants, the mean and median perceived likelihood to drive under the influence of each substance was somewhat or very unlikely, and the perceived risk of driving under the influence of each substance was experiencing moderate or great harm. Those who had versus had not heard of Delta-8 tended to report that they were more likely to drive under the influence of Delta-8 and had lower DUI-related perceived risk. 59% of participants reported that they had an equal perceived likelihood to drive under the influence of alcohol, cannabis, or Delta-8. The second most common response was reporting a higher perceived likelihood to drive under the influence of alcohol compared to any of the other substances examined at 21%. Participants most often reported having higher alcohol-related DUI risk compared to cannabis and Delta-8, or equal DUI risk across all three substances. Overall, 72% of people reported past year use of alcohol, 51% cannabis, and 22% Delta-8. Among those who reported past year use of each of the respective substances, 34% reported past year DUI of alcohol, 33% DUI of cannabis, and 57% DUI of Delta-8. Among individuals who used both cannabis and Delta-8, DUI was slightly lower for cannabis than Delta-8. Among participants who used both alcohol and Delta-8, slightly fewer individuals reported past year DUI of alcohol compared to Delta-8. And individuals who used both alcohol and cannabis had a similar DUI prevalence after using alcohol or cannabis at 33% each. Lastly, among those who had used all three substances, DUI occurred most often after using Delta-8, followed by cannabis and alcohol. Next, to examine DUI-related perceived likelihood and risk, two multivariable multinomial logistic regression analyses were used to examine associations between past year use of each substance and which substance they had the highest perceived likelihood to drive under the influence of, and which substance they perceived to have the highest DUI risk. The referent group for the outcome was having an equal perceived likelihood or risk for all three substances. Past year alcohol use was not significantly associated with which substance they perceived as having the highest DUI likelihood. Participants who reported cannabis use had lower odds of having the highest perceived likelihood to drive after using Delta-8. Those reporting Delta-8 use had significantly higher perceived likelihood to drive under the influence of alcohol or Delta-8 compared to an equal perceived likelihood. Again, past year alcohol use was not significantly associated with which substance they perceived as having the highest DUI risk. Cannabis use was associated with higher odds of believing that driving under the influence of alcohol was the riskiest. Past year Delta-8 use was associated with higher odds of perceiving driving under the influence of alcohol or cannabis to be the riskiest. And those who were non-Hispanic white had higher odds of perceiving DUI of cannabis to be the riskiest. We next utilized three multivariable binary logistic regression models to examine associations between substance-specific DUI perceived likelihood and perceived risk, and past year DUI behavior for each substance among those reporting use of each respective substance. We statistically adjusted for age, sex, and race ethnicity. So among those with past year alcohol use, those with a higher perceived likelihood to drive under the influence of alcohol and lower alcohol-related DUI perceived risk had higher odds of driving under the influence of alcohol. Among people who used cannabis in the past year, those with a higher perceived likelihood to drive under the influence of cannabis had higher odds of driving under the influence of cannabis. And among those who used Delta-8 in the past year, related DUI perceived likelihood and risk were not associated with Delta-8 DUI behavior, although perceived risk was borderline statistically significant. Males had higher odds of driving under the influence of Delta-8 compared to females. All participants, regardless of their substance use, were then asked two open-ended questions. Please list all of the ways that driving while under the influence of marijuana and Delta-8 are similar, and please list all the ways that they're different. Those who reported ever driving under the influence of cannabis and Delta-8 were additionally asked, on the times you have driven while under the influence of a cannabis product, such as marijuana or Delta-8, what techniques, if any, did you use to reduce the potential risk? Overall, 167 participants responded to the open-ended questions, assessing factors related to driving under the influence. Qualitative data were analyzed in Microsoft Excel and used standard qualitative methods in inductive analysis. First, two coders familiarized themselves with the data and independently coded each response using open coding. These codes were combined to develop a code book, which was refined via multiple iterations with the entire team. And after finalizing the code book, the two coders independently coded each response and subsequently met to establish a consensus on all responses. Finally, key quotes were selected to best represent the findings, and qualitative responses were organized into 3 overarching categories: strategies to reduce risk before driving, strategies to reduce risk during driving, and comparing cannabis and Delta-8 DUI risk and effects. So of the 71 participants who responded to the open-ended question about protective behavioral strategy use, 24% responded that they did not use any strategies. Many participants indicated complete avoidance of DUI. For example, one participant said, "I'll never drive under the influence, it's not a good idea." Some participants said they limited the amount they used before driving or waited some time before driving for the effect to wear off. And of concern, a few participants did mention consuming various types of citrus to reduce the impairment from THC. Many participants reported using behavioral modification strategies such as driving slowly on city streets, not the highway, look for less busy streets and going slower with the car, and drive slow, avoid freeways and rush hour. Some participants also said they used strategies to improve focus or reduce distractions, such as turning off their phone or radio or rolling down the windows to keep themselves alert. 2 participants reported using strategies that seem likely to draw increased attention to the driver, such as blinking their hazards. Of the qualitative responses regarding differences between cannabis and Delta-8, 14% were people saying, "I don't know." Most participants felt Delta-8 and cannabis carried a similar DUI risk. For example, one participant said, "I don't know much about either cannabis or Delta-8, but I can imagine they're about equal risk." Others reported that using either before driving was unsafe. For example, one participant said, "Both are psychoactive drugs and both impair your ability to drive." Most participants based their DUI risk perceptions on the perceived strength or potency of the substances. For example, some individuals said it was safer to drive after using Delta-8 because Delta-8 is a little weaker than cannabis, while others said that DUI of cannabis was safer because Delta-8 was stronger than cannabis. This demonstrates the differences in perceived potency of Delta-8 versus cannabis, which may be related to the prior experiences with the substance or to the marketing of Delta-8. Relatedly, some mentioned that tolerance may impact risk. For example, one participant said, "They're probably both much more impairing with a low tolerance and not that dangerous to drive under the effects of once you're used to it." Some participants discussed how cannabis or Delta-8 may impact risk. For example, the impact on reaction time and motor control were both mentioned by one participant saying, "Both would convey a feeling of being high, and the driver would be too relaxed and complacent to react in a responsible manner to traffic." One participant mentioned a potential impact on judgment by saying that the driver would be too excited and ignore the traffic and drive over the speed limit. Another participant also mentioned that they both lead to drowsiness and one may feel sleepy. Lastly, several participants did mention the possibility of experiencing negative mental or physical consequences, such as a headache, vomit, tremor, anxiety, or dizziness, while a few people did mention potential positive effects of Delta-8 or cannabis use on DUI risk, such as being more calm or more focused. So overall, this was the first study to examine and compare DUI perceptions related to alcohol, cannabis, and Delta-8. Most participants did report an equal perceived likelihood to drive under the influence of each of these substances. And these results can be explained in part by our qualitative findings, which suggested that most people felt that DUI of any substance was dangerous. In contrast to having an equal perceived likelihood for all, the proportion of driving under the influence of each respective substance was highest among those with past year Delta-8 use. Most participants reported that they believed driving after consuming alcohol carried more risk than driving after using cannabis or Delta-8. This may be because of the presence of checkpoints and reliable testing for breath alcohol levels. Similar checkpoints are very rare for testing cannabis use. Previous research suggests that Delta-8 is often perceived to be safer than cannabis, including being marketed as diet weed. On the contrary, in this study, participants on average perceived driving under the influence of Delta-8 as riskier than driving under the influence of traditional cannabis, and were actually less likely to drive under the influence of Delta-8 compared to traditional cannabis. Additionally, using cannabis was associated with lower Delta-8 DUI perceived likelihood, while using Delta-8 was associated with higher DUI cannabis risk perceptions. These associations may suggest two unique groups of individuals: those who use Delta-8 because it's perceived to be safer than cannabis, and those who prefer traditional cannabis. Delta-8 specific perceived likelihood and risk were not significantly associated with Delta-8 DUI behavior in adjusted models, although Delta-8 perceived risk was borderline statistically significant. Future longitudinal research with larger sample sizes is needed to better understand these findings. Due to its relative novelty, participants may be less familiar with Delta-8 compared to cannabis. For example, qualitative responses either indicated participants didn't know the differences between cannabis and Delta-8, or they were divided on whether Delta-8 was safer or riskier than cannabis. Qualitative information regarding the effects of cannabis and Delta-8 was not consistent. For example, some respondents were concerned about driver sedation, distractibility, and reaction time, while others reported positive effects such as making the driver calmer and more focused. Some individuals said they didn't use any strategies to reduce the risk of driving under the influence of THC, while others mentioned using concerning strategies that were not evidence-based, such as consuming citrus to reduce their high. Drawing from health behavior theories, interventions focused on risk perceptions and protective behavioral strategies to mitigate DUI-related risks, such as having a designated driver, hold potential and thus require additional research to inform targeting messaging strategies, particularly related to Delta-8 given its recent entrance into the US market. Data were from a convenience sample of young adults in the US, and so results may not generalize to other age groups or the broader US population. We also did not consider state cannabis or Delta-8 laws, which may influence cognitions and behaviors. Additionally, because we compared DUI perceived likelihood and risk across substances, those who ranked some of them, but not all of them equally, were coded as missing for the relevant analyses. Given the small sample size and therefore reduced statistical power, estimates may be imprecise. And lastly, the qualitative data were from 3 open-ended survey questions, which provides limited insight into the depth and complexity of participants' opinions and experiences. And I just wanted to leave you with this. On the screen is a picture of a bunch of Delta-8 products that I took in various shops across Fort Worth. You can see various products including cookies, Nerds ropes, flavors including Oreo, Candyland, and Cotton Candy, which are all youth-oriented. Thank you.
All right, thank you for your presentation, Dr. Leparco. I will start the Q&A session. Let me share my slides. All right, so I'll start the Q&A session with a few questions of my own, and then we'll hear from participants. So if you have a question, please make sure you type it in the Q&A box. If you type it in the chat, there's a lot going on in the chat, so it might get lost, so please use the Q&A box. My first question is, some respondents reported differences in perceptions regarding potency, risks, and effects of Delta-8 THC versus cannabis. Where can our audience find current and accurate information on these substances?
So that's a great question. Unfortunately, it's not one that's easily answered. Because Delta-8 and these related substances are relatively newer to the market, so they entered due to the 2018 Farm Bill, there's not a lot of research on them. So there are a few human subjects studies with very small sample size that talk about the different potency risks of them. But really we're very limited. So I would just say if you're looking for information, make sure you always go to peer-reviewed sources, published literature, and not the internet.
Yes. Okay. And you mentioned future longitudinal research with larger sample sizes are needed to better understand the findings. Do you have plans to continue this research?
Yes, I'm actually currently a collaborator on a longitudinal R01 right now, which is focused on cannabis broadly. And we have a bunch of questions on these products, so not just specific to Delta-8, but the other kind of similar ones in those compounds, so Delta-10, THCV, THCA, those kinds of things. So we're definitely trying to figure out more, learn more about these products.
Okay. And lastly, how can coalition members and substance use preventionists in the field best use the findings from your research?
Yeah, so it's very important that we figure out what to do with these substances. So Delta-8 in this class of substances is very tricky because they're assumed by many to be federally legal. Some states have tried to kind of address them, but really it's just a patchwork frame of regulations and policies. So we need to talk to our Congress members. We need to try to make sure that these products are banned at the federal level, same as regular cannabis, that there's no loophole, because right now there's no child restrictions, there's no age restrictions, child resistant packaging, anything like that. So anyone can order these products online and have them delivered straight to their door, can buy them at gas stations, things like that. So just making sure that we're educating people that these products exist, since there is a lot of unintentional use of these products, and also just trying to talk to Congress and fill in that loophole.
Mhm. All right, so those are all of my questions. Thank you for sharing. We'll move on to participant questions. I've been seeing a lot of people asking about the slides and the presentation. So it will be shared on our website by the end of the week. I will also send a follow-up email to all attendees with a link to our website where the presentation will be uploaded. Okay, so first question. So here, this is what the Q&A box looks like if you have additional questions to ask. Did you happen to ask if participants were a college student? Curious if any differences between college student and non-college student in your study would be significant.
So we did ask, I don't know off the top of my head if there were differences, but with regards to like traditional cannabis use, college students typically tend to have a higher prevalence. So I would assume that holds true for Delta-8. But yeah, I don't know off the top of my head.
Mhm. And someone asked if you said 52% of people that knew what Delta-8 was, 70% of those people have used it.
Yeah.
So they're saying that means approximately 35% of the population has used Delta-8. Did you want to address that and like generalizability? I know you touched on that towards the end of your presentation.
So that data is from that longitudinal sample I talked about, 4,000 young adults age 18 to 34 across the US. 52% were aware of Delta-8 and 70% had, and of those 70% had lifetime use of Delta-8. So there are a few caveats to this. Obviously, it's among young adults age 18 to 34. So it's not necessarily generalizable to populations outside of that. We also recruited via Facebook. So maybe, you know, social media users, there's differences in that sampling. But yeah, it really just goes to show that even though these are quote unquote newer products, I mean, they've been on the market for 4 years now. There's a lot of knowledge about them. There's a lot of use among those who are knowledgeable, or who are aware at least. So it's definitely something that we need to try to learn more about and address.
Someone asked, how is cannabis intoxication being like in a DOI being measured by officers? Do you
I
know
I
currently?
don't know the answer to that. I know that there are blood tests that you can do that are relatively rapid. I saw someone put in the chat at the beginning of the session that sometimes those results take a long time to come in. So law enforcement may not necessarily be testing if alcohol is already present. At least that's what the person in the chat said. So yeah, I don't know. I know that they're trying to work on ways to measure THC in breath, but I think that research is far behind that for alcohol.
Could you just touch on a little bit? Someone asked, just to be sure, Delta-8 and other Delta numbers are derived from legal hemp plants. Is it stripped, distilled from the plant, and concentrated for use?
What was the second part?
Is it stripped, distilled from, or distilled from the plant and concentrated for use?
Okay. So yeah, so basically there's, the hemp cannabis plant. Delta-9 THC is kind of, traditionally that's been cannabis, marijuana, weed, that's been what it is. And since this farm bill came out, some people in the industry were like, okay, we can change the chemical structure slightly different, and then now it's technically assumed to be legal through this loophole. So because the concentrations of Delta-8, Delta-10, other similar things are very small in the plant, basically what they're doing is they're taking large amounts of CBD and extracting that through heat, applying different acids and solvents and things like that in order to change the chemical structure to reach Delta-8, Delta-10, all these other things. Again, because there's no restrictions or regulations on this, we're not necessarily sure that the products that they're marketing as Delta-8 is actually Delta-8 unless we test them, which is very difficult to do with like mass spectrometry. And also a lot of these products, because they are undergoing this synthesis process, have a lot of contaminants still left in and things like that. So really, it's kind of just a large kind of free-for-all right now with not a lot of testing of these products, seeing actually what's in them. If they're saying they're Delta-8, is it actually Delta-8? Does it have, the potency matching label, things like that?
I did see one question asked about Delta-8 and how it's consumed, if it's ingested, smoked. Do you know more information about that?
Yeah, so exactly the same as traditional cannabis. It comes in all the different forms, flower, pre-rolls, vapes, edibles, tinctures. Really, it's just anything the same as traditional cannabis.
Mhm. And do you know of any programs or online, in-person, other resources on Delta-8? It looks like specifically a lot of people have a lot of questions on Delta-8. But a lot of that is likely, like you said, because there just isn't that much research, that many
Yeah.
resources available.
Yes.
Do you have any other direction of where they could find reliable, accurate information?
Yes, so there is a fact sheet online by Dr. Matthew Rossheim at the University of North Texas Health Science Center, which is a one-page fact sheet on these products, and it kind of goes over the different product class that Delta-8 is a part of, so like this derived product class. Really, we're very limited. There's only, a handful of us doing this research, and so it's kind of just been trying to stay on top of things, trying to get the information out there. We have kind of published quite a few things on this, but it's been harder to disseminate the fact sheets and do these presentations and things like that, but we're working on it.
Someone asked if CADGA could provide resources on hemp plant. I do want to mention that CADGA does have a practical theorist on cannabis. It did come out a few years ago, so there is an opportunity to update that, but it could be, if you would like to read it and get base information, according to when that was released. I believe it was around 2018. but you can find that on our website. Someone asked if traditional THC that is regulated if it's regulated for contaminants unlike Delta-8, which you mentioned in your presentation.
So in state licensed dispensaries, each state has kind of their different rules for these products. But yes, for the most part, products that are sold in these licensed dispensaries are tested for contaminants. There are some, some caveats to that because they are grown rather than synthesized. It's not something that is like as big as a problem for these derived cannabinoids like Delta-8. So more often they're testing for like the strength and like the potency of these rather than contaminants. They do test for some contaminants, but it's mainly like fertilizers, pesticides, and things like that. But again, it's very specific on what state.
All right, well, thank you so much for your presentation and the audience for sending in your questions. Here's the evaluation for the webinar. Please take a couple minutes to evaluate. You can scan the QR code with your camera, or you can type the link into your browser. This is how you can get a letter of participation if you complete the evaluation. You can download it from the thank you page at the end of the survey. You must fill out the survey to get the letter, and you must download it right away because you will not be able to access that page later. I will also send this in the follow-up email to all attendees, as well as, again, the link to the recording on our website. And thank you, Dr. Loparco, for sharing your time, your expertise, and the research that you're doing in an area where, like you said, it's very limited and is really needed. And if anyone in our audience has evaluation or research related questions, you can reach out to CADGA's evaluation and research team. Thank you for your participation and your continued support. And remember to complete the evaluation. We'll see you next time.
Thanks.